Karen's scream echoed through the neighborhood like a dying cat being electrocuted. Which, to be fair, wasn't far from the truth. Her arms flailed in the air, her margarita launching in a perfect arc before crashing into my freshly mowed lawn. The moment her feet touched the water, a sharp jolt sent her airborne, her shriek turning into a garbled mess of disbelief and horror. The entire HOA party froze, watching in stunned silence as their queen of tyranny hit the ground with an unceremonious splash. I took a slow sip of my lemonade, watching the chaos unfold from my patio. It was almost poetic, really. Justice served with a side of chlorinated water. But to understand how we got here, we need to rewind just a bit. Because, believe it or not, this wasn't just about a pool. This was about war. A war that started the day Karen moved in and decided the entire neighborhood was her personal kingdom. And unfortunately, I was the villager she despised the most. It began with small infractions. A passive-aggressive letter about my garbage bins being placed 1 inch too far from the curb. A fine for my grass being uneven in color. Then came the threats. My mailbox was too modern, my car didn't match the aesthetic, and my dog was too loud despite never barking. I knew from day one that Karen had made it her mission to make my life miserable. But the final straw? The moment that turned this petty war into all-out revenge? She used my pool without permission. Not just once. Not just twice. She treated it like a community amenity, walking in with the confidence of someone who owned the place. At first, it was just her. I'd come home to find wet footprints leading from my backyard, my pool water suspiciously lower than when I left. Then she started inviting guests. One Saturday, I pulled into my driveway, expecting a quiet evening. Instead, I walked into a full-blown HOA pool party. Music blasting. People laughing. Karen lounging on one of my expensive pool chairs like she was Cleopatra. I stood there for a solid 10 seconds, trying to process the audacity. "Karen," I finally said, voice straining to remain calm, "why are there 30 people in my backyard?" She barely glanced up from her oversized sun hat. "Oh, Ethan! Don't be such a grump. The community deserves to enjoy this lovely space. It's such a waste to keep it all to yourself." I scanned the scene in disbelief. People I had never spoken to were splashing around like they owned the place. My outdoor bar had been raided, a couple of dads standing around my grill, flipping MY steaks. A kid, no older than 10, was aggressively dunking a smaller kid near the deep end. My blood pressure hit dangerous levels. "You need to leave," I said, forcing a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. Karen sighed dramatically, waving her hand like I was a pesky mosquito. "Oh, come on. It's just for a few hours. You should be happy to contribute to the neighborhood." "Contribute," I repeated, my eye twitching. "Karen, this is my private property." She didn't even look guilty. If anything, she looked annoyed that I was interrupting her little kingdom. "Oh, relax, Ethan. Don't be so selfish. We voted, and the HOA agrees. Your pool should be accessible to the community." I blinked. "You can't vote to steal my property." She laughed. "It's not stealing. It's sharing." I clenched my fists, inhaling sharply. "Karen, if you and your guests don't leave in the next 5 minutes, I'm calling the cops." That got her attention. Her face twisted, her usual smugness cracking just a little. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. You wouldn't." I pulled out my phone. "Try me." A tense silence settled over the yard. Karen pursed her lips, then stood up, adjusting her oversized sunglasses. "Fine. But you're being completely unreasonable. Just wait until the next HOA meeting. This attitude will not go unnoticed." I didn't care. They could have all the meetings in the world. I just wanted my backyard back. One by one, her guests slithered out, throwing me dirty looks as they grabbed their towels and half-eaten snack. My expensive lounge chair was stained with margarita. My once crystal-clear pool was murky with sunscreen and spilled beer. The moment they were gone, I locked my gate and sat at the edge of my ruined pool, seething. That's when I knew. This wasn't over. If Karen wanted to keep breaking into my yard like it was her personal resort, she was in for a surprise. I spent the next week researching. My first thought was security cameras, but that wouldn't stop her. I needed something more immediate. Then I stumbled upon an idea. A harmless, completely legal, and undeniably hilarious idea. It involved electricity. Before anyone calls the cops on me, let me clarify. I wasn't planning on electrocuting anyone. I'm not a supervillain. But a small, harmless jolt? Just enough to teach her a lesson? That was doable. A little electrical engineering, a carefully placed switch, and my pool was officially off-limits to unwanted guests. I tested it on myself first. I dipped my toe in, bracing for impact. The jolt was just enough to make me jump, my whole body tensing for a split second before I laughed. It was perfect. Now all I had to do was wait. Sure enough, the next Saturday, I heard the unmistakable sound of my gate creaking open. I peeked through my blinds, watching as Karen, in her usual oversized hat and designer swimsuit, strutted toward my pool like she owned it. I grabbed my lemonade, stepped onto my patio, and waited for the show. She dipped a single, manicured toe into the water. Zap! The reaction was immediate. A high-pitched, undignified screech tore from her throat as she jerked back, slipping on the wet concrete. Arms flailed. The margarita she had been holding flew into the air, landing with a tragic splash in my bushes. And then, with all the grace of a falling walrus, she tumbled backward into the pool. Screams erupted from the HOA guests who had, once again, helped themselves to my yard. Some of them backed away in horror, others scrambled to help, but Karen was too busy flailing and gasping to notice. I took another sip of my drink, suppressing a grin. Justice had never tasted so sweet. Karen's scream still echoed in my mind, a melody of poetic justice that played on repeat every time I thought about that glorious moment. But if there was one thing I knew about Karen, it was that she wasn't the type to back down. No, she was like a cockroach, persistent, irritating, and nearly impossible to get rid of. So, I wasn't stupid enough to believe that her humiliating dive into the pool was the end of it. If anything, it was just the beginning. The very next morning, I woke up to the sound of aggressive knocking at my door. Not just any knocking, the kind that said, "I'm angry, I have too much time on my hands, and I'm here to make your life miserable." I groaned, dragging myself out of bed, already knowing exactly who it was. Sure enough, the moment I cracked open the door, there stood Karen, her hair still slightly frizzy from yesterday's unexpected swim, her lips pressed into a thin line of fury. "You electrocuted me," she spat, her voice shaking with a mix of outrage and embarrassment. I raised an eyebrow. "You broke into my backyard," she scoffed. "It's not breaking in if the gate is unlocked." I gave her a long, unimpressed stare. "Karen, you do realize how insane that sounds, right?" She crossed her arms, refusing to acknowledge how ridiculous she was. "You put an illegal electrical trap in your pool. You could have killed me." I leaned against the doorframe, completely unbothered. It was a harmless deterrent. Just a little zap. The same kind of shock you'd get from touching a doorknob after walking on carpet. She pointed a finger at me, her eye twitching. "You are going to regret this." With that, she spun on her heel and marched away, but not before kicking over one of my potted plants like a disgruntled toddler. I sighed, running a hand down my face. This wasn't over. Not even close. Within hours, I received a formal notice from the HOA. Apparently, I was being accused of endangering the community with hazardous property modifications. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Karen had the audacity to break into my yard, use my pool without permission, and then file a complaint against me when she faced the consequences of her actions. Instead of panicking, I decided to handle this with the same level of pettiness that Karen had mastered so well. I sat down, drafted my own complaint, and submitted it to the HOA board. It detailed how Karen had repeatedly trespassed on private property, violated personal space, and hosted unauthorized gatherings on land that wasn't hers. To make things even sweeter, I attached the footage from my security cameras. Crystal clear evidence of her waltzing into my backyard like she owned the place. It didn't take long for the HOA to call an emergency meeting. I arrived early, taking a seat near the front with a cup of coffee, prepared to enjoy the show. Karen stormed in not long after, her face flushed with righteous indignation. The rest of the board members shuffled in, most of them clearly uncomfortable, likely because they had been enjoying my pool just as much as she had. The meeting started with Karen launching into a dramatic speech about how I was a danger to the neighborhood, and how my reckless behavior could have caused serious injury. She emphasized words like hazardous and negligence, as if she was building a legal case against me. I waited patiently, sipping my coffee, until it was my turn to speak. I stood up, cleared my throat, and turned on the TV in the meeting room, where I had prepared a presentation. The footage played in perfect clarity. Karen and her guests laughing, drinking, and treating my pool like a public water park. The moment the footage of her getting zapped played, a few people in the audience stifled laughter. Karen's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "So," I said, turning to the board with an innocent smile, "I just want to clarify something. I own the property, I pay for the maintenance, and I have full legal rights to my backyard. But Karen and her friends believe they are entitled to use it whenever they want, even after being repeatedly told no. And now, because she faced a minor consequence for her actions, she wants to paint me as the villain." The room was silent. Even the board members who were usually Karen's biggest supporters shifted uncomfortably. I could tell they were realizing that this had become bigger than they anticipated. One of the board members cleared his throat. "Well, technically speaking, Ethan does have the right to privacy on his property." Karen shot him a look that could have set him on fire. I leaned back in my chair. "And while we're discussing safety concerns, let's talk about the damages caused by the unauthorized HOA party in my yard. The broken furniture, the clogged pool filter, the stolen drink. Should we address compensation for that?" Karen's jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth might shatter. The board hesitated, realizing that siding with Karen would make them look like fools. After some forced discussion, they finally ruled that Karen had no right to my property and that any further trespassing would result in serious consequences. They tried to downplay it to spare her ego, but the message was clear: she had lost. Karen stormed out before the meeting even ended, her shoes clicking furiously against the floor. I watched her go, resisting the urge to smirk. But I wasn't naive. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. Over the next week, she made her pettiness known in the most Karen-like ways possible. Suddenly, I was receiving complaints about the most ridiculous things. My mailbox was apparently too offensive, my car was an eyesore, and my grass was threatening the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. Each complaint was pettier than the last, and each one was an obvious attempt to get back at me. So, I decided to escalate things just a little further. I printed out a massive sign and placed it right outside my backyard gate. It read, "Private property. Trespassers will be zapped." It wasn't technically a lie. The neighborhood buzzed with amusement. The other homeowners, who had long been sick of Karen's antics, found the whole thing hilarious. Even the HOA board members, though trying to remain neutral, couldn't completely suppress their smirks. Karen, on the other hand, was livid. A few nights later, I caught her sneaking around my house with a flashlight, clearly trying to find something, anything, she could report me for. Unfortunately for her, she wasn't exactly stealthy. I turned on my porch light and leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Something I can help you with, Karen?" She jumped, clearly not expecting to be caught. I was just checking for code violations." I tilted my head. "At 11 at night?" Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she turned on her heel and stomped away, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly with each furious step. At that point, I knew one thing for sure: this war was far from over. But Karen didn't realize something important. I was enjoying every second of it. The war had reached its final stage, and I knew Karen wasn't going down without a fight. After the HOA meeting humiliated her in front of the entire neighborhood, she had two choices: accept her defeat and move on, or double down on her delusions of power. Predictably, she chose the latter. The next morning, I found a fresh HOA violation notice taped aggressively to my door. I sighed, peeling it off, already expecting something ridiculous. Sure enough, it accused me of creating an unsafe environment that endangers the well-being of the neighborhood. The hypocrisy was almost impressive. Karen had trespassed, held an unauthorized pool party, and been caught sneaking around my property like some unhinged raccoon, but I was the danger? I crumpled the paper, tossing it into the trash without a second thought. If Karen thought a few petty complaints were enough to break me, she clearly hadn't been paying attention. She wanted to play dirty? Fine. I had more than enough energy to keep this feud going. The next day, a tow truck pulled into my driveway. Confused, I stepped outside, only to be met by a smug-looking Karen standing beside a man in a uniform. She crossed her arms, smirking like she had already won. "This vehicle is in violation of HOA Code 4B9, she announced, practically vibrating with self-satisfaction. I blinked. "What?" She gestured to my car. "Your vehicle is considered abandoned if it remains parked in the same spot for over 72 hours. I stared at her, then at my car, which I had literally driven the day before. "Are you serious?" The tow truck driver looked hesitant. "Sir, do you have proof you've been using the vehicle?" Without a word, I pulled out my phone, opened the security footage from my driveway, and showed him clear footage of me getting into my car and driving off the day before. The driver sighed, giving me an apologetic shrug. "Looks like this isn't a violation," he muttered before climbing back into his truck. Karen's smugness evaporated instantly. "Wait. You can't just leave." The tow truck roared to life and pulled away. I turned to Karen, watching as her eye twitched in frustration. "You're getting desperate," I said. Her face flushed red. "This isn't over." She stormed off, her flip-flops smacking against the pavement with each furious step. I watched her go, shaking my head. She was losing control, and she knew it. But she wasn't done yet. That night, I received an email from the HOA board. Karen had officially filed a lawsuit against me for reckless endangerment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I actually laughed when I read it. The audacity of this woman was truly unmatched. She had no case, no proof, just a bruised ego and a grudge she couldn't let go of. I responded by forwarding all the security footage, the written complaints, and even screenshots of the text messages Karen had sent me over the past few weeks, including one where she outright admitted to using my pool without permission. Within hours, the HOA's lawyer responded, essentially telling Karen to sit down and shut up. But I wasn't satisfied with just defending myself. It was time to go on the offensive. The next day, I filed my own lawsuit: trespassing, harassment, and property damage. I attached the cost of repairing my ruined pool furniture, the pool filter, and the cleanup fees from her unauthorized party. The numbers weren't outrageous, but they were enough to make a point. Karen had spent weeks trying to ruin my life. Now she was about to get a taste of her own medicine. The moment she received the official court notice, she snapped. She marched up to my house, fists clenched, her voice shrill with rage. "You can't sue me." I leaned against my doorframe, unfazed. "Why not?" Because I'm on the HOA board." I smirked. "Not for long." The words hit her like a slap. She recoiled, eyes widening. "What do you mean?" I pulled out my phone and showed her something even better than a lawsuit: a petition. The neighborhood had had enough of her. They were done with her fines, her rules, and her endless power trips. The petition to remove her from the HOA board had already gathered more than enough signatures. Karen's face drained of color. "This is a joke." "No," I said, pocketing my phone. "This is justice." The next HOA meeting was the most satisfying event I had ever attended. Karen sat stiffly in her chair, glaring at the board members as they read out the petition. The room was filled with homeowners, many of whom she had harassed with her absurd rules over the years. The vote wasn't even close. Karen was officially removed from the HOA board. The moment the decision was finalized, she shot up from her chair, knocking over her water bottle. "You're all making a mistake," she screeched. One of the board members sighed. "Karen, please sit down. I built this HOA. I made this neighborhood better. I couldn't help myself." "You mean you made it unbearable?" A few people chuckled. Karen's eyes snapped to me, filled with pure hatred. You did this." I shrugged. "You did this to yourself." She let out an inhuman noise, grabbed her purse, and stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard that one of the plaques on the wall rattled. The war was over. But I had one last move to make. The next weekend, I threw a pool party, the biggest one the neighborhood had ever seen. Music, food, drinks, the works. But there was one rule. Karen was not invited. She watched from her window, seething, as the people she once ruled over laughed and celebrated without her. At one point, I raised my glass in her direction, giving her a little toast. She slammed her blinds shut so hard I thought they might break. A week later, a "for sale" sign appeared on her lawn. I stood in my yard, sipping my coffee, watching as movers loaded her belongings into a truck. She avoided looking at me, her entire body tense with humiliation. As the last box was packed, she climbed into her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, just before pulling away, she rolled down her window and gave me one final glare. "I hope you rot in this neighborhood." I smiled, taking a deep breath of the fresh, HOA Karen-free air. "I think I'll be just fine." And with that, she was gone. I turned back to my house, my pool sparkling in the sunlight, my lawn perfectly manicured, my peace finally restored. I had won, and it felt absolutely glorious.